Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the University of Chicago Institute of Politics Speaker Series event, Effective Activism Across Generations. My name is Ella Storms, and I'm excited to welcome you all to today's event. I'm a second year at the college from Southern California, and I am studying political science and economics. Here at the IOP, I am a W+ Winter Institute co-chair, a You Shy Votes voting ambassador, and an event ambassador. I am thrilled to introduce you all to tonight's panelists, who will be examining effective protest movements and discussing their frontline roles in the recent history of activism. Tonight's panel features Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Mr. Peter Staley, and Dr. Rami Nashashibi. Congresswoman Lee is the highest-ranking African-American woman appointed to Democratic leadership and a longtime champion of the anti-war movement. She has served California as a U.S. representative since 1998, currently representing California's 12th district. Before serving in Congress, she worked on the presidential campaign of Shirley Chisholm and alongside the Black Panther Party. She currently serves as chair of the Majority Leader's Task Force on Poverty and Opportunity and co-chair of the Policy and Steering Committee, Pro-Choice Caucus, and Cannabis Caucus. In 1987, Mr. Peter Staley became an early member of the grassroots political group ACT UP, or AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, where he staged several protests against government and medical agencies for their response to the AIDS epidemic. He also founded the educational website, aidsmeds.com, as well as Treatment Action Group, which works towards increasing research on HIV, tuberculosis, and hepatitis C treatments. Dr. Rami Nashashibi is a community organizer and UChicago graduate with a PhD in sociology. He founded the Inner City Muslim Action Network in 1997 and continues to serve as executive director. The Inner City Muslim Action Network is a nonprofit based on Chicago's South Side that aims to address the structural and systematic injustices impacting individuals and marginalized communities by cultivating art and leadership, directing a holistic health center, and organizing for social change. Moderating this event is Katie Benner, a correspondent for the New York Times who has covered the Justice Department and other major institutions that impact American life. As a reminder, please silence or turn off your cell phones. When it is time for Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience. Please line up and remember that priority for the first questions will go to students. Please visit the IOP's website for more information on future speaker series events and other IOP opportunities, including what to expect if you're expecting Trump at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, October 15th at the Chicago Theological Seminary, and Battleground Banter featuring David Axelrod and Karl Rove at 5:30 p.m. on Thursday, October 17th at Ida Noyes Cloister Club. Finally, I would like to invite you all to give a warm welcome to Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Peter Staley, Dr. Rami Nashashibi, and Katie Benner. Thank you.
So you're here. Good work. Hi, hello, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the University of Chicago and the Institute of Politics for hosting what I think is going to be a great conversation, especially because it is so incredibly timely right now with what has been happening on college campuses, with the war, the ongoing war in Gaza, and a very, very heated upcoming election. This could not have happened at a better time. So thank you so much for allowing us to have this kind of conversation. And of course, thank you very much to our panelists. I want to jump right in because there's so much to talk about. And Peter, I want to start with you. You were just here meeting with students on campus and speaking with them about what works, what makes a successful campaign. You know, ACT UP was not just an organization that made real change, lowered the price of life-saving drugs, forced multiple presidential administrations to focus on a disease that was killing so many millions of Americans. In order to do it, you had to cut through social resistance, real homophobia, and a lot of prejudice in order to affect this change. It's a huge number of things to push back on all at once to get those legislative and policy wins. Can you walk us through what you believe really worked when you were taking over buildings and when you were laying down in the streets? What else was going on?
Yes, well, ACT UP was formed 6 years into the AIDS crisis. The first cases were reported in '81. The country ignored it. Reagan was in office. It was born in March of '87. And job number one really was shaking the entire country and making them aware and feel guilty about the fact that they had ignored this epidemic and that they were letting thousands of their own citizens die because of their own hatred towards us. And that guilt tripping took the form of big national protests, being on the nightly news. We became the movement du jour of our time. By 14 months after our first demo, the whole country knew the movement ACT UP. And there had been rising homophobia during the AIDS crisis. We started in '81 at a terrible spot. We were one of the most hated communities in the country. And it just got worse. The AIDS made it worse and worse. And 2 years after the launch of our movement, there was a 21% drop, according to Gallup, in the homophobic feelings of America towards us. A huge shift, and it's an obscure question on sodomy laws, but it was the one that was being measured that they had been asking since '77. So we did successfully shake the country and make them feel guilty. And similar polls in '88, '89 showed that 80% of the country, 80% thought we should spend more on AIDS research. And that forced Reagan and Bush and Congress to start coughing up all the dollars. And by year 3, we were being called this powerful AIDS lobby by other disease groups that was getting more than our fair share. Just a stunning success in 3 years. Of course, our death count just kept going, and we had 10 years of activism before we saw the breakthroughs that allowed me to be on this stage today. But getting that popular support forced the politicians to do the right thing. There is a political kind of law of physics that if you want to get politicians to do something, if that's your goal, getting the public on your side makes that easier. Getting the voters on your side makes that easier. It's not always the case. Sometimes your targets aren't politicians, but that equation is pretty much been sacrosanct over time. And to the extent that you can get the public on your side, your job is going to be much easier. And ACT UP did that in spades.
Congresswoman Lee, this is so interesting because you were a protester who supported ACT UP when you lived in California. This is before you were in politics. Clearly, it struck a moral chord with you. I'm curious about what was it about the movement that galvanized you to act? And then how did you take your experiences on the front lines of that battle with you as you went into mainstream politics, which was not known, has never really been known, I think, for being a place of radical change?
Well, thank you very much. Really glad to be with everyone this evening. Well, I have always been an activist. I was a community worker with the Black Panther Party, and I had no option. When I was called to an ACT UP march and rally in front of the Berkeley City Hall, the Berkeley Post Office, this was in 1989, there was an African-American woman whose name was Maudel Shyrick, she passed away at 104, but she fought to be on the city council because they had an age limit, and she was vice mayor in her 90s. She called me up, and I was in the middle of my first campaign running for the California legislature, and she said, "Barbara, you've got to come down here. John Iverson and myself are at this march and rally with ACT UP, and you need to be here." I said, "Yes, ma'am," because she was a mentor and like my second mother, and she was an unbelievable woman, granddaughter of slaves. She was just phenomenal. Look her up, Maudel Shyrick. So I went down to the ACT UP rally and march and protest. The cops came. I think they didn't take us to jail, but I think they arrested us, right there. And, I learned then that this was a movement I had to be active in, that I had no option because, first of all, people were dying. And so if people are dying, what do? Just stand by and just say, it's okay? No. And then people were being, there was so much hate. So for me personally, that's no, I have to do something. So I did. And then I was elected in 1990 to the California legislature. So I took all of what I had learned and that activism into the California legislature and worked on legislation to disrupt that horrible needle exchange ban. And I did a lot on HIV and AIDS in the California legislature. And then when elected to Congress, I actually led the effort to establish the Global Fund, PEPFAR. I worked with George Bush, the Global AIDS Initiative. I did the legislation to lift the travel ban that allowed us to have an HIV/AIDS conference back here in the United States. And to this date, we've saved 25 million lives. A long way to go, but we've been at it. So,
and how did you push back on your colleagues when they did not want to make these changes? How were you able to convince them? What tools did you use?
Well, when they saw me working with George Bush, who I 99.9% disagreed with, I was the only one who voted against the authorization to go to war right after the horrific events of 9/11 Afghanistan. I mean, I did not like his policies. When my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, saw Barbara Lee over at the White House working with George Bush to try to save lives and to find a cure and an end to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, then they had to stop and say, what is this about? And I think that's what, finally, not many led on this, but they said, okay, Barbara, whatever you want us to do, tell us. And I'll never forget, I went to the Congressional Black Caucus and said, look, we met with George Bush. This was my issue I brought up with him. He said that he wanted to work with me on it. And there was a lull period, and I didn't hear much. In December of that year, every member of the Black Caucus signed a letter that I led to tell him that in his State of the Union, he should announce a major initiative to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and he did. And so people began to see that I was leading on this issue, but not for any other reason other than to find an end to HIV and AIDS and to save lives. And that's what it was about. And I think when you come at people like that, it wasn't a political issue for me. I mean, this was not about a campaign or raising money, or it was just about what I believed I needed to do since nobody else was doing a lot on this. And that galvanized people to follow.
It's one of these interesting things. How do you get different constituencies to come together into agreement? Rami, one of the things that you are best known for is your ability, your desire to bridge people across religions, across races, and to create a coalition. So when you're working as a community organizer, how do you get community organizations and politicians to understand, to speak the same language when both sides are working with totally different tools, with totally different ends in mind, and different versions of what success looks like?
Yeah. First and foremost, again, want to thank the organizers for this. And I was joking with Congresswoman Lee. I was like, I had 500 other things that I was trying to get to this week. But when I saw the Congresswoman's name on this list, I knew I could not say no. So could we give it up for Congresswoman Lee? You are a legend and someone that I feel very honored and same. I'm just extraordinarily honored to be here with all of you. But I think look, we're in an organizing town. I come out of sociology here at the University of Chicago was also a place that people like Saul Alinsky kind of cut their teeth on better understanding community, understanding the local dynamics that pit us against one another. But collective self-interest. Self-interest is often sometimes seen as kind of not the most pristine word, and it sometimes gets conflated with this notion of selfishness, where organizers constantly have to, push back on that. And what we're really getting at is people have to see their stake in an issue. And organizing at the grassroots level is really, I think there's a prophetic, spiritual rooted context. I've taught a class in a seminary just across the street, community organizing a spiritual practice. And I look at the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, through the lens of community organizing and other prophetic teachings. And I think part of the core is this idea of what it means to build a larger collective self-interest. How do we work in various kind of coalitions and alliances to be able to allow us to understand the world as is, meet each other where we're at, and begin to kind of cultivate a better understanding of what my stake is in being able to connect and align with larger issues. I'll give you an example here on the South Side. A Pentecostal preacher who's a really great mentor of mine and became a state senator, as she was trying to move a relatively conservative church to think about their role in immigration marches back when Sensenbrenner came out with that horrific bill and there was mass movements. I remember Patricia in her church using a phrase that I think continues to resonate, because rather than getting at any complicated language, she would always say this to her church congregation: winning alone is nothing but delayed failure. Winning alone is nothing but delayed failure. In other words, if you're going to win, if we're going to make movement in a city like Chicago, in a state like Illinois, on black liberation, we cannot do it on our own. We're going to need those Latino folks. We need some of those Palestinian folks. We need other communities, and we need to be able to build the type of broad-based alliances and coalitions that allow us to collectively work towards each other's liberation.
So what I really love about the conversation as it sits right now is that we have, I think, a great framework for what makes a protest movement feel relevant, feel moral, feel urgent, and feel like it includes people it helps people understand why they have a stake. So I want to turn then, with this in mind, to Gaza, because the war's been going on a year now. And I think that if you ask every person in this room what they think of Gaza, what they think the stakes are, what they think the impact is, you would get as many different answers as you get people in the room, maybe with some loose agreement here and there, but it's one of the issues we come to with really different understandings. So how do we understand the protest movement that we've seen over the past year in the context of what works and what doesn't? What about these protests have we seen, do you think, is working? What is not?
Well, I would say, with all respect, a slight exception to the question. I think what's working here and across the globe is that there is a collective coalescence around some unifying issues, that it is not a war, it is a genocide, and that genocidal assault is something that here in this country, for instance, our connection to that is becoming increasingly clear. The polls among average Americans across the country, and certainly young Americans, are beginning to reflect that the consensus among some of the greatest scholars on this notion of what constitutes a genocidal assault, that there's extraordinary plausible evidence, if not a cogent case. And so I think what we're beginning to really feel across the country in a really profoundly unifying way, in spite of the divisive politics, in spite of some of the ways in which this gets rhetorically presented, is a common collective consensus around the sanctity of human life, the same thing that woke us to the consciousness that genocides of any kind are things that should be fought against, and that here in this country, we are more complicit in this genocidal assault on civilian population than any other country and any other genocidal assault in modern history. And I think the fact that students particularly, but others across the sector, and many have been fighting this fight for a long period of time, but certainly over the last 12 months, have been pushing this and challenging us, including many in the Jewish American community that I think have been extraordinarily profound in their ability to both present a critique as well as speak to the existential angst that exists in the Jewish community that understandably is also connected to this issue.
And I think one of the interesting things about this answer is we're having a conversation, it just dawned on me, without even a clear view of what it is we're trying to accomplish.
Perhaps.
Because again, what are we trying to accomplish in Gaza? What is the end goal? In some ways with ACT UP, the goals were very diffuse: an acceptance of gay Americans, an acceptance of LGBTQ rights, a civil rights battle that had but it was a little bit amorphous, but also very concrete things. We need a drug created, and we need a drug in our hands affordably and right now. Very concrete. What are we fighting for in Gaza? I think is interesting because you're, I think, saying that for somebody to act morally in Gaza as an activist, they have to believe that it is a genocide. And what is the end? What is the end? Is it the end of the kill? You know, there's a debate. Is it a two-state solution? Is it a one-state solution? So it makes, I think it might complicate the activism a little. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, but you know, it's interesting because, again, if you think about the movements that were across the country, including on this campus, the demands were quite simple. I don't even think they were that radical. They were about disclosing and divesting. They were about disclosing our collective investments in war machines, and they were about then divesting from those things. And that is in you know, contravention to not only international law, but contravention to American law, the Leahy law, that says we should not be arming in any way, shape, or form any military assault on a civilian. So even before any complicated political solution, I think that demand is what was unifying students and people across the country, that on some level there should be a basic demand around disclosure and divestment from that level of, you know, assault on civilian populations.
Mm-hmm. And so how, for the panel, I'll open it up, how do you think that the war has impacted the coalition of the left, from moderate to progressive, in terms of how we create a shared vision and agree on what the stakes are that bring us together?
Well, I appreciate the focus on the current movement and what it might be doing wrong and right as far as picking narrow, specific, short-term targets versus long-term. For me, the wider issue is that activism itself has become so much harder in this day and age. I'm convinced that the activism that I was a part of in the 80s and 90s, that ACT UP, if it happened today, we may well have failed, no matter what we did. So it wasn't so much our brilliance as movement tacticians. It was, in this day and age, we're dealing with a country specifically and worldwide now where there is no shared epistemology that you can play with the public. You're going to be instantly, we saw it with Black Lives Matter, you're instantly going to be labeled a terrorist group by Fox News. Mm-hmm. You're going to get 48% of the country hating you right away, no matter what you do. So to get that momentum is 10 times harder than it was back in our age. And how do you move things now? So. So we're constantly just turning to the movement itself and saying, you're doing things wrong. Yeah. I'm still just blown away that this generation is far more impassioned and active on any issue, especially this one, than my generation was when I entered Oberlin College during the last months of the Jimmy Carter administration. You guys are blowing my socks off, and thank God you're out there, and on both sides of the issue, those fighting the pro-Palestinian side and those fighting against the rising tide of anti-Semitism. All of it matters, and you've got a harder environment in which to do this work. Some of the lessons I did learn in ACT UP was that over the course of that 10 years, we had periods where we, I thought, had this, really shed selfishness. We were a beautifully selfless movement. We were focusing on the fact that it wasn't just us in the room, the gay white guys who were HIV positive, but there were multiple communities being affected. Already at year 2 of ACT UP, a majority of those newly infected in New York City were Black New York City residents. Children were becoming infected. Hemophilia We were getting the first reported cases of Africa. We were fighting for the greatest good, for the greatest number, way beyond our core membership. And that just, that selflessness became the core of our activism. And when you focus on helping that greater good, it focuses what you do as your targets, and then what you do at the actions to get to that, to change that target and to reach that short-term goal. And that focusing sometimes is a narrowing. I mean, if you're a selfish movement, and ACT UP got selfish at times, where the passions of the activist is what becomes paramount. That allows you to do anything. If you're like, it's my anger that matters, and only that matters, then you can do anything and justify it. And we justified some shit that lost us a lot of support and didn't achieve much. But I think the greatest moment in activist history, in American history, was the March on Washington in 1963. And a lot of people don't know that in the initial planning of that, there were a lot of initial planning to make it very radical, to shut down DC for 2 or 3 days, to target various agencies, lots of civil disobedience. And then they built the coalition to do it. It became the Big Six, including the ACLU, et cetera. And they focused on the goals they wanted to achieve. They were looking at that Civil Rights Act that they wanted to pass, and possibly a Voting Rights Act after that. And there was a moderating influence. When you focus on the goal and not just the passions, and it narrowed it down. I mean, the ACLU, you had the students on the one side, you had SNCC with John Lewis, and you had the ACLU, and not the ACLU. I keep saying that wrong. And NAACP. Right. Sorry. And as kind of the moderates. But it condensed it into something that was, frankly, more palatable to the wider public. But they achieved their goals. I mean, we got the Civil Rights Act within a year. We got the Voting Rights Act 2 years after that. It is one of the most powerful moments of activism in American history.
And famously, Congressman Lewis changed his speech to make it more palatable.
They changed his speech on the student radical had to pare back his speech. I mean, would we do that today? I don't know.
I don't know. What do you think, Congresswoman?
Wow. Well, let me think now. Am I an activist right now or a member of Congress? I've had to take my activism into the halls of the United States House of Representatives and try to legislate. And I'm on the Appropriations Committee. And so, and just with regard to the Middle East, for example, this has been quite a passion of mine in terms of the ultimate goal, peace and security for the Palestinian people and for the Israelis. And how we get to that point is why I think a ceasefire is so important right now, because what's taking place now, I think, is going to prevent that from happening. Secondly, as an activist, member of Congress, I have seen many movements, and a few of us have gotten on the inside. And I think one of the, joys that I experience, even though it's a very difficult period. I mean, 26 years in Congress, 7.5 years in the legislature, and 11 years working for a member of Congress is a long time that I've been on the inside. And so I've seen, though, the activism of young people be reflected in many of the policies and funding priorities and initiatives now that we see coming from the United States Congress. It's very hard because of the politics and the money. We've got to get money out of politics. But I think that the moments of activism that I've seen over the last 10 years and now with the whole efforts around a ceasefire, all of the efforts around mass incarceration, all of the efforts around tax reform, economic security, all the issues around racial justice, you name it. I see more activism being reflected now with members of elected bodies saying what the people are saying for the people. And so I'm encouraging people to continue with this activism, because even though it's hard, when I started school, I couldn't go to public schools because I was Black. Ended up having to go to Catholic school. So I share that because it was because of these movements that I was finally able to go to a public school. And so I would encourage young people, the intergenerational coalitions that have been put together, to continue with that, because it's the organizing and the activism that's going to make elected officials pass laws and funding priorities that are going to transform this country.
I just want to say to the audience, you know, we're about 30 minutes in, and so if you have questions, if you're thinking about questions, think about making that trip down the aisle to the microphone, because I'm going to start looking for your input probably in about 15 minutes, and I know you all have a lot to say, so we're excited to hear from you. You know, I think this is such an, this is, the Congresswoman and I were speaking about this before. What does it mean to protest? There has to be an element of hope or of belief in your ability to change, because if you're protesting into hope, that's a very different result than protesting into a sense of hopelessness or that the action won't matter. And I think because we're bumping up against the election, we did see during the Trump era a tremendous amount of protest. I think it unleashed some of the most activity I had seen in my adult life, certainly. Probably nothing like that since the 90s. With big moral implications, right? When President Trump signed the executive order known as the Muslim ban, I think it was in the first month of his presidency, it was an outpouring of moral outrage as people went to the airports. CEOs, citizens, everybody is unified.
Can I say one thing here?
Please.
Because this is an example of the inside-outside pressure.
Yes.
When that happened, immediately, when he signed that EO for the Muslim ban, I'm on the Appropriations Committee. I put in an amendment to defund the Muslim ban.
You get to use the, see, that's the difference. When you're on the inside, it might not seem as radical, but you actually have the lever of power that none of the protesters at the airport had. And I think that's such an important lesson. I'm sorry, wait, did you want to say something?
No. I think you were getting to a really important point about like sustainability.
Yes, because then a year later, the Supreme Court upheld the third version of the Muslim ban, which did not significantly change it. I mean, it had some provisions around green cards in it, and it had some safe harbor for certain kinds of relatives. But at the end of the day, it's still passed muster with SCOTUS, and this is so. You know, what do you?
Well,
think
for me, again. It's the nuances sometimes between activism and community organizing, and I think both have, you know, the activist sensibility, and I think I've been in both spaces, mostly in a community organizing space, and certainly appreciate the lanes for that. So you have the public, you know, you have the role for, of course, those in public policy and those in the public sector. As activists, they're going to be, you know, oftentimes on the first front lines of trying to awaken a collective consciousness around the, you know, moral urgency of a particular issue, like the one, again, the genocidal assault on Gaza. That is awakening a type of sensibility across the country and across the globe in ways that I think, as a Palestinian American who's worked in a number of different coalition alliances, have never seen in my adult life. And I think there's something about this particular moment. But I think we also know that as organizers, even the most powerful kind of feeling of an activist sensibility can be, evanescent and could, quickly flee us if we're not building real community organizing bases, if we're not institutionalizing if we're not rooting that sensibility in more long-term, coalitions and alliances that are committed to long-term victory, as well as those kind of, what it means to move policy like criminal justice reform. We're sitting here in the city, a mile or two away from the largest life expectancy gap in the country between Streeterville and Inglewood. 32 years. How did we get there? And what is it going to take? It's not going to just activism to awaken us to the extraordinary racial, socioeconomic disparities that created that criminal reality that we're all inhabiting and in some ways a part of. It's going to take real commitment, movement, alignment to make ourselves realize that we have a collective interest in being able to fight for something like that on a policy level, on an economic level. And I think that's in some part for me the distinctions between how you can see a moment like the Muslim ban may elicit a collective outcry, but that's not sufficient in sustaining the kind of more collective long-term movements to make real change.
Do you have anything you wanted to add, Peter?
Yeah, we did see some of the biggest protests in American history during Trump. The Women's March was the single biggest day protest in U.S. history. And Black Lives Matter in the spring of 2020 had the single largest participation of Americans in any movement in any history. We had 30% of the country taking to the streets for BLM that summer, which still knocks my socks off. That's huge success. But again, I go back to this day and age where you have such extraordinarily effective and large participation with seemingly less or little obvious payoff because of not because of what they did or did right or wrong, because of this day and age. And until we get, I hate to say it, this is about effective activism, but maybe activism itself is losing its punch.
And I'm going to ask one more question and then start taking audience questions. To that point, you're right, we did not get the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and Roe did fall. So I hear what you're saying. I wonder about the idea of transparency in the context of this idea of how has the world changed around activism to blunt it. The civil rights movement that you brought up, that March on Washington is extraordinary. The compromises made to make it palatable, effective, broad-reaching, and powerful, also an incredible feat of human beings coming together. What was happening in the background, though, in LBJ's office was also extraordinary. It was activists coming together as leaders to meet with the President of the United States and several people who opposed them to make compromises, basically to wheel and deal and get a deal done. It was not transparent. And if a lot of that coalition had known about the conversations happening at the White House, they would have abandoned the movement. They would have been very, very, very upset. They would say, you're selling us out, because they wouldn't have agreed with the idea of those compromises for a long-term project. We're in a different age now where transparency is expected. How do you tell the coalition, you guys are doing very important work, and I need to go do this very important work with Barbara quietly, where we're not going to get everything we want? How do you do that in this era that has changed so much?
There's still a balance there. I think even in recent movements, there isn't a total fishbowl over all the organizing that's been happening in the student movement this past spring, for instance, behind the scenes. You can find your articles. Yes, it eventually gets exposed, but the wider public doesn't read it. They don't see it. So the movement can play an inside and an outside game if it wants to, and if it allows it. And most movements, I think, do. There's always infighting within movements, And to the extent you can control that and keep it down before you split up, which is what happened to ACT UP in year 5, obviously the better. But you know, I don't think there's a transparency problem today. I think there is a political problem today, and to that extent, we need to fix our political house before we start blaming the movements.
Let me say, yeah, transparency is extremely important. But you know what? You have to know your bottom lines also. For those on the inside who are working with, and this is supposedly how democracy is supposed to work, right? And activists and organizations, when I'm working with groups on certain issues, they know they know how far I'm gonna go now, and I'm gonna have to negotiate, right? But I know what my bottom lines are. And you know, if you get to that point, then you have to go back to the drawing board. But I'm gonna give you just one example. I've introduced legislation several years ago, establishing a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission here in the United States. We've never had one for the descendants of enslaved people who were brought here from Africa, enslaved for over 250 years. So we fund the United States Institute of Peace, which has established these truth commissions after genocides, crimes against humanity, slavery, all around the world. We've never done it in the United States. Okay. Fast forward to H.R. 40, reparations, which I was one of the original co-sponsors with Representative Conyers. And so when I introduced my legislation and we had H.R. 40, there was a little bit of tension between, having a truth commission and reparations will conflict with each other. And, you know, the president may see and the Congress may want the truth commission, which would wipe out the movement for reparations. So Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee and myself, God bless her soul, I mean, we worked together to make sure that the activists weren't divided and made sure that in my Truth Commission, transformation was H.R. 40, reparations. And so we worked together to make sure we unified around that, where people came together so that we could be strong when we talked to the White House about an executive order or what we could do to get the legislation passed. And so I think it's important to know that, you know, organizers, activists have to be able to trust their elected officials to a certain extent, but their policymakers and elected officials have to let them know what their bottom lines are and where they won't go or will go.
I would only add to that from an organizing sensibility. Again, another quote often misunderstood and via Linsky, and again, he's only one of many theorists from organizing, is no permanent friends, no permanent ally, or no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. Now, again, that sounds very Machiavellian, but really at the end of the day, that was simply saying our commitments are what we're committed to. If this particular, you know, I have folks that are great friends I used to organize with now become politicians by saying, you are a politician now. However beautiful you may be as a human being, I'm an organizer. My role is still to agitate you and hold you accountable. I don't care, and I'm going to be committed around the certain wins that we need. I do think that there are degrees of, you know, the principle about, as you were alluding to, those conversations with LBJ and King. Yeah, even today, there are organizers brought in the room. The fear of appropriation, the fear of, you know, co-optation is very real among organizers. There's ways in which we try to mitigate against that to still make sure that I'm not the one person trying to negotiate with a power base that I'm, you know, extraordinarily at a disadvantage with on behalf of an entire movement. There are ways in which you can still, you know, trying to get in the room with the layers of accountability, how to continue to have certain sets of conversations to make the way for potentially a win. Again, the divestment movement, for instance, across the campuses this last year, had varying degrees of extraordinary challenge. I'm ashamed to say, and I hate to say it here at the University of Chicago, the way it resulted here for me was deplorable. The way it may have resulted in other campuses where there was a little more of opportunities for students to actually get to a space with administration to make a kind of a compromise of sorts, to begin to explore what actually disclosing and divesting could actually look like, at least opened up a pathway of conversation. And I do think that, of course, that required some of those students to have conversations with administration. And yes, there were probably others that were not happy with that, but the reality was that there was an attempt to try to be transparent and accountability around the main issue, which in that case was disclosing and divesting.
So first question, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alyssa. I'm a third year in the college, majoring in global studies and religious studies, and I'm also a part of a W+ here at the IOP. And my question is actually for you, Dr. Nashashibi. So I study religion, and I'm sure you know lots of young people are sort of deconstructing, and there's a lot of disdain for organized religion in general. And you said that you see organizing as sort of prophetic. And I feel like in a lot of these organizing spaces, at least in my generation, that religion is sort of seen as the antithesis to what we're trying to achieve. So how do you see your faith, or just faith in general, as being important to effective activism?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And yeah, for me, this is a absolute very deeply spiritual moment. It's a very deeply spiritual set of practices. I could not do what I do without putting my face on the floor at least 5 times a day. And I know I am not alone in other organizers across all faith traditions about the work that we're up against. I will say this, that young people across this city and across the country inspired me with a sense of spiritual relevance. A dear mentor of mine who organized on the South Side, Rabbi Robert Marks, wrote a profound letter to a series of congregations in 1966, the day that he marched with Martin Luther King in Marquette Park, a day that he was assigned to be a neutral observer. And he wrote to those congregations about how there was no neutrality that day. It's a 3-page letter, and it was all really and it was wrote with loving affection to his fellow co-religionists, but he was writing about the relevance of faith, that if I did not march with King on this day, that our faith tradition may lose its relevance. And I think that's the biggest threat to any religious community. And what I saw in this last year, I had a very beautiful, somewhat a disagreement with Brother Ibu Patel, some of you may know him, of Interfaith America, about this issue, who wrote an article, and I went to him the next day. I said, Ibu, I disagree passionately with everything you just wrote in that article, because what I experienced on those campuses over the last year were Jewish brothers and sisters, Muslim brothers and sisters, First Nation, evangelical students, Pentecostals sitting at encampments, talking about their faith in relationship to the complexity of this issue, holding space for one another, being respectful for one another. I think that story was not told. I think that story was actually, in fact, manipulated to be conflated with, things that were often very marginal to what was happening on life. So I am still very optimistic about the role of spirituality in the role of cultural movements, both here and across the globe.
Yeah, thank you. And the next question?
Hi, my name's Barbara. I'm a first-year MPP student here, and I actually have a very similar question to Alyssa, which is just some version of in recognizing that today we have a very different, just demographic arrangement of religion in America versus, the 1960s American Civil Rights Movement. Taking that as a given, how do organizers, especially for progressive causes, articulate the moral and spiritual stakes of issues in terms that maybe aren't religious anymore?
So Peter, would you want to take a crack at this? Just sort of what, this question of moral movements. How do you create a moral movement that doesn't have religion at its center, or is that kind of codified spirituality?
Well, you're asking a proud atheist, so.
Thank goodness we have one.
For me, my higher power is people coming together to help each other and to lift each other up, and even more so, when a community comes together for a greater good, and actually affects change on a larger scale. I've seen it all the way from a small 12-step meeting to a large movement that has an entire community behind it. And it's a thing of beauty. I don't personally need to believe in God to tap into that power, but I think it's what can really power change and power movements. And beyond, civil disobedience activism, can really power organizing as well. Political organizing, trying to take control of a political party, which I think might really help current movements these days to fix things on a political level. So, yeah.
It's great. You have to have that hope. Next.
Yeah, let me just comment on that very quickly, because I'm on the board of directors of a seminary. And we, a couple of years ago, paid a heck of a lot of money to get this firm for 3 years to figure out why students weren't coming into the seminary. And one of the questions, even though they considered themselves spiritual but not religious, and so one of the questions that had been asked, which resonated, which was and I'm a Christian. I was raised in the Catholic Church. I'm not a Catholic now, but I'm still a Christian, member of a progressive Baptist church. But bottom line is, the students said, if they asked this question, if you knew that Jesus Christ was a Palestinian, would you be more interested in the Christian religion? And every student, 90% said yes.
I find that very fascinating. I'm going to ask you more about that later.
Yeah.
I need to know more.
Because of the movement. It was because of
and I think that speaks to this.
The movement and activism of students and the relationship between Christianity and seeing Jesus as a Palestinian revolutionary.
And we were talking, we were glancing at this before with why do you think what's happening in Gaza has galvanized such a huge swath of the public? Americans are not known for caring about wars overseas, foreign policy, people who do not live in the lower 48. We don't do that. And yet, this is a movement that has brought together a very broad and passionate group of people. Why do you think it is? Because of the moral center of it, this deep feeling of morality around it?
Yeah, I think it's the common humanity. I mean, the dehumanization of people, the killing of people, regardless of who you are and where you are, whether it's in Israel or Palestine or Africa or Sudan or wherever, the Congo. I think it's the deep sense of disgust behind people not being treated as human beings. And I think that speaks to the core of people in terms of their goodness. And I think everyone comes here as a good human being. And so I think we're seeing some of that now.
That's very interesting. Go ahead, please.
Folks, thank you all for coming out. My name is James. I'm a student at the Harris School of Public Policy. I've appreciated very much the conversation about religion. I'm a proud Catholic, and that informs my beliefs as well, but I'm going to change subject a little bit. I wanted to ask about electoralism versus activism. It's been a big debate recently, especially on the left, especially for activists, at least that I follow on Twitter. But I want to ask more generally versus just about today, what is the relationship like between elected officials and activists? Does it really matter who's in office? Because or is it about really having that social movement, holding people accountable regardless of who they are?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I want to speak to that, and then maybe the last question too. I really do think that, again, we're in a moment. I think we cannot underestimate how absolutely unparalleled and unprecedented this moment is in modern history. In the last 12 months, the equivalent of close to 7 to 8 atomic bombs we're talking about have been dropped on Gaza. And so and unlike even other genocidal campaigns across the world, there are young people that are awakening to their connection to that in very, very profound ways. And I think that's really important. I do think it links to this question, because whether you're a seasoned community organizer that knows that this mayor and his or her administration or their administration is going to come and go, you have to be able to build enough kind of momentum and movement to withstand any particular political cycle. I do think seasoned organizers certainly know that we have to build enough movements that can withstand election cycles, while at the same time, from an activist standpoint, we know we actually are absolutely dependent on those in political power for particular policies and appropriations. So there is a delicate balance between both the type of agitation that's necessary to get the type of right, to allow for an advocacy that brings the right type of folks in office that can move some issues, while still building a power base that can withstand any one particular cycle. I don't know if that's helpful. All right.
Thank you. Please, go ahead, please.
Howdy, my name's Elliot. I am a first-year MPP student here over at Harris. Just for a little bit of reference, I use he, him pronouns, and I am a transgender student. I worked in my home state legislature of Tennessee. So I'd like to ask, earlier it was said that one of the first steps, one of the vital ingredients of activism and advocacy was a consensus around the value and the sanctity of human life. I'd like to hear about any of the panelists' history with first having to convince someone in a position of power that you are a human being that is experiencing a civil rights issue, and then B, that you are worth the effort in order to work towards resolving it.
I think this is an important question. Normally I wouldn't have every panelist answer, but I think because your three answers might be unique, I would love it if, briefly to answer. I think this is a good one. Anyone can start.
I'll start. ACT UP's great. What ACT UP brought to the history of LGBT activism. Obviously, we had Stonewall. It wasn't a huge national story. It became one over time, but it certainly was within the community. It spurred a couple years of activism, some radical activism. Those groups ended up having infighting. They kind of phased out. The gay men went off and enjoyed their gay liberation for about a decade. The national gay groups that got formed in the 70s and early 80s played a very delicate don't rock the boat game nationally, because the homophobia was so bad and shared by both parties that they played mostly an inside game trying to get things done slowly over time, and were very afraid that if they were kind of full frontal with the country, that the backlash would be worse. Of course, when all of us started dying and we had our backs literally against the wall, ACT UP said, we've got to throw that playbook out, and we've got to go full frontal with the country and show them who we are, show them our humanity, show them our determination, our fear, show them how we've been taking care of each other while you all have been letting us die. So when we sat down at the table with politicians, or very often with civil servants at the FDA, at the NIH, and the CDC, we let it rip. There was screaming, there was the full passion of showing our fear and our anger that our loved ones were dying. And that is a key part of effective activism, is showing your full humanity.
And let me tell you about the Black Panther Party and the 10-point program, which I was a community worker, as I said, with the Black Panther Party for years. I wasn't a member, but I worked very closely with Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Out of the 10-point program, the George Jackson Free Medical Clinic was established.
Right.
In that clinic, for the very first time in America, sickle cell disease was put on the agenda, and Black people died disproportionately from sickle cell, and it's primarily targeted toward people of Mediterranean descent. I mean, the disease disproportionately impacts African Americans, Africans, and people of Mediterranean descent. It was the Black Panther Party that forced this country to begin to address the sickle cell anemia disease in America through their activism. And so now it's a big deal. We're almost at a cure, and I've been working on this for 25 years. So it was the Black Panther Party, though, that started that.
Thank you for that question. I think you're touching on perhaps the single most piercing pain point for anyone connected to the Palestinian community over the last 11, 12 months, is the utter and complete feeling of the erasure of our humanity. And I had the very surreal and disturbing experience of being one of the only Palestinians in a room, in the Roosevelt Room, selected very early on, very reluctantly, to speak to President Biden at a table of 6 other predominantly Muslim and Arab Americans. I did not want to go in that room because the night before, I was very reluctant initially. The night before, the day before, is when, you may have remembered, this is early in November, the numbers were coming out, and he said he questioned the statistics. And I said, hell no, I'm not going into that room. There was a woman from Gaza who had lost family members, probably lost a good 40 to 50 family members. And she was supposed to be in that room. I had the only one that was access in Arabic, told me on the side, Rami, you're the only Palestinian in our community right now that has clearance to be in that room. And she used a phrase in Arabic that said, whether you like it or not, you're gonna go in that room. And it was more like one of those situations where, yes, ma'am, yes, sister. And I went in there and I sat, I was closest to the president, and I attempted to sit there and question the ability to question numbers at a moment where people are looking at body parts on TikTok and YouTube videos and try to challenge him to reckon with that. And you know, there was an illusory moment that somehow he would be able to get his head around that, but I think I was completely mistaken. And I think the reason why activists and organizers have completely gave up on President Biden's ability to stand with the Palestinians as human beings is because, irrespective of whatever momentary statement he would make, the reality on the ground is you cannot tell me you believe in the humanity of a people while you are accepting and supporting and condoning and arming what you're seeing. In other words, nowhere in this country would we ever accept the logic that you can blow up universities, hospitals, refugee centers, food centers, because you think a nefarious group may have a command and control center anywhere near it, and that the casualties are acceptable. That rationale alone has reinforced, I think, the feeling that we have utterly been erased, that our humanity has been erased, and it has been a pain point this year. So
was it worth it for you to go into that room?
I think in some ways the question that you asked about whether it was worth it to be in the room, I think, to agitate and to be public about the agitation, I think I made some mistakes afterwards, which I abided by some request that they made to be a little more private about what he said. And in the first NPR interview, I abided by that, I think now foolishly. I should have been going on blast about what he said. And I did a week later. And I continue to feel like the erasure of Palestinian voice, unfortunately, continues to prevail and make a lot of people very skeptical even about this current race with Kamala Harris, because we have not seen a radical transition. And as recently in the DNC, as you all know, once again, the Palestinian voice of being able to speak to our common humanity was denied.
We have only a few minutes left, so thank you very much for that question. We have only a few minutes left, so I'm just going to take one more question, and then I want to turn to the final, have the final question be about that race, because that is such a very important question for activists. So the final question, go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Carmelita Rivera. I'm a lifelong Hyde Parker. 65 years old. I've been standing here with an aching back. But I'm thrilled to be here in the place that, from what I understand, Dr. King spoke during his activism. So that's a thrill for me. Also, it's thrilling to be here in the company of Congresswoman Barbara Lee. I've only been to Berkeley once, and that was to go to Dock of the Bay nightclub, and I had a wonderful time. My question is there a such thing in Congress as being too progressive? I'm concerned that I remember seeing Cori Bush from Missouri camp out Capitol Hill steps, I think protesting homelessness. We still have homelessness. I remember a sit-in that took place on the floor of the Congress when John Lewis was still living about gun violence. We still have over 50,000 Americans killed by guns here at home. I'm very concerned about that, yet Cori Bush was not reelected to Congress. Jamal Bowman from New York was not reelected. Was that some kind of setup, or what happened there that the two very progressive members of Congress were not elected back to office? Thank you.
Congressman, why don't you take this?
Yeah, there's no such thing as being too progressive in Congress, first of all. Secondly, you've got to be very progressive in order to fight the very right-wing Republicans. So you have to be very progressive to do that. What happened with Cori and with Jamal, unfortunately, was money. We've got to get money out of politics and get to public financing and campaigns. Otherwise, this democracy will stay flawed. And that's what happened.
So in the speed round for the last question, I know what you had mentioned about the Harris campaign is so interesting to me, because it's most searing, I think, with the Harris campaign and the Democrats. People do not want to vote for her. They do not want to cast their vote for her because they so fundamentally disagree with, probably I would put Gaza right up at the top and then fill in the blanks for the next few issues. On the right, it's a little bit different, but there are definitely some people who are very, very anti-abortion, who are falling out of love with Donald Trump, and they're like, he's not going to give us what we want. Again, he used us, he's not going to give us what we want. But at the same time, a Harris administration would be a disaster for them, but they don't want to vote for Trump. So what do you think how do you think a voter should think about activism when they're at the ballot box? Is it worth it to say no to a candidate because you cannot stand them and you would rather see them lose? And you know what you're going to get with the other side, but you can fight it. Or do you hold accountable the candidate?
I think the organizing strategies and tactics across the country sometimes vary state to state in terms of the message being made. I do think, again, we don't want to, in this particular political cycle, diminish those who are holding up the war or the assault in Gaza as single issue voters. This is not for them a single issue. It's intersectional in so many profound ways that, as I think the argument made, the two references to Cori Bush and to Jamal Bowman are a perfect example. They didn't just lose to any random money. That was close to, $18 million and more that ever been infused to any kind of primary congressional race in modern history. And it was because of their principled moral stance on the genocidal assault on Gaza. And we have to think about what that means in this current moment.
Does that mean you don't vote for Harris?
That means I think there needs to be some real calculation about where you're going to have the most leverage. In some states, I think the argument about amplifying third-party candidates is important because we need to break the kind of stratified bifurcation of political power. And in other places, I do think people have to make another distinct calculation. I'm here in Chicago. I'm also, again, organizing and voting not just for this particular cycle. I'm thinking about what's happening on the ground. I'm thinking about the life expectancy gap. I'm thinking about the closed schools that are still on the South Side. We're thinking about the larger set of issues. But I do think that, there is a strong argument for those who are saying that they want to cast a protest vote in this moment.
Well, of course, I'm on the National Advisory Board for the Kamala Harris campaign. So, I mean, I'm working day and night to make sure we elect Kamala and Tim Walz. And I tell you a couple of things. It's very important, and I think this is the moment for activism to emerge in a more powerful and more structured way, because God knows, well, I don't think anyone in here believes that we need a Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean you're voting for the lesser of two evils. I think the voices of people and the power of people, if we win, if Kamala and Tim win, I hope that you're at the White House each and every day. There've got to be protests, there've got to be organizing on issues, on funding priorities as it relates to, of course, the issues of peace and security throughout the world, but schools, criminal justice reform, on the Farm Bill is coming up, on all the issues that we have to deal with in this country and abroad. And so I hope that, again, I'm working hard to make sure that they win. But the day after, I hope we are organized and people are ready to move forward to demand that our voices are heard in the White House and in the House and in the Senate. And that's, for me personally, where I am. And again, as one of the first members of Congress to call for a ceasefire, mind you, around October 10th, I am out there working very hard to make sure that we elect Kamala and Tim Walz and not Donald Trump to the White House.
Hey, well,
So,
two very,
what can I
very
say?
nuanced answers, which I very much appreciate. It's what we want from conversations here at the Institute of Politics. I so appreciate that all of you were willing to be here today, that we had this. I thought it was a great conversation. I loved where people agreed, where they disagreed, and it was so thoughtful. So thank you all so much. You've done a wonderful job, and thank you again to the University of Chicago. Thank you to the great audience for asking excellent, thoughtful questions. I hope you all have a great night. Oh, and grab a burritos on the way out.